Find what I'm looking for here. Yeah, we're going to be in 1 Peter chapter 1, and we're going to start reading in verse 17 again. I told you last week that we had two different thoughts that I wanted us to consider out of this passage that kind of run parallel and overlap. And we're going to see a little bit of how they overlap and how they run parallel. So we're going to look at the other one I wanted to look at that we talked about last week. Just a reminder, in 1 Peter, we're looking at this tremendous inheritance that we receive as being the children of God, not like nominally the children of God. It's not like this technical title or maybe just the way we like to like a metaphor, but we're actually born again by the Spirit of God, and that makes you a child of God. You have His nature. You are an heir of all His wealth and power, and so you need to think of yourself that way. And the point that I'm trying to drive home through these, and perhaps I'm beating a dead horse now on it, but I tend to do that because there's too often I find that something will be said 5 times, 10 times, and then it'll be said again, and everyone will say, "Well, why didn't you ever say that before?" And so it's like, it doesn't matter how often something is repeated to us, we tend to not hear things. And that's one of the interesting things that we find in the scriptures. Paul makes that observation. Jude makes that observation. Peter also makes that observation, that it's very important to repeat the same things again. And I know that nothing that we're talking about is really novel. It's nothing that you haven't heard probably 100 or 1,000 times in your life. But it seems that at the same time, there are many things that we should know very well that as Christians we don't know. It's kind of the motto of what I've been trying to cover the last few weeks is that the old is the new. It's like we have all this preaching in the world today and on the internet, and they're all looking for something novel, something new to say, and what's old and what is true and what was originally written by the apostles seems to be overlooked. And I think that is a mistake. I think we need to refocus on what the scriptures actually say, right? Not read into them what we wish were there. There's a lot of things I wish were in the scriptures. Right? Like, do not salute each other with a holy hug. That would be a great verse in the scriptures. I'm sure it just got omitted. It was not intentional. It was meant to be there. So there's a lot of things we wish were in the Bible. We wish the authors had said. And there are many things that are true and good and needful to be said in church that aren't in the scriptures. So don't pretend that they are if you want to say those things. Right? You want to say something that's not in the Bible? Don't pretend it is, because I'll notice that it isn't. You know, you might fool other people, but there's some of us in this room that are thinking, that's not what's in the Bible. It may be perfectly good thing to say in church, but that's not what the scriptures actually say, right? And so we do need to focus on what they actually say. It's very important. Very important. And so we want to look at this, and what Peter is saying is that we, because we're born again, we're heirs of this incredible kingdom. We are priests and kings and princes, and Peter keeps repeating this throughout his epistle. Paul deals with this in Ephesians, and is dealt with in a few other places in the New Testament, and it's because it's very easy for you to pretend it's not true. Super easy to do. Because when you look in the mirror, you don't see what Peter describes. You see what you used to be. You remember what you used to be so vividly that you think that is what you are. And it isn't. It isn't. I don't know how to persuade you of that. All I can do is tell you that what you think of yourself probably is not true. And Peter is telling you, you need to think of yourself in a different way. Because when you do, everything about your life will change. And so, that's what he's dealing with, and I don't want to go in too much because you can go back and look at the videos. We've recorded those. They're online at the YouTube on our YouTube channel. You can go there and you can watch them and get caught up if you weren't here, or if maybe right now you're thinking, well, I've never heard that, and you were sitting there but you didn't hear it. You can go back and listen to it. But now let's talk about the other thing that he deals with here, and we'll start in verse 17. We're going to read a bunch of verses in this passage, read this long text, and then we're going to talk about what Peter is saying here. He says, and if ye call on the Father, and this is let me just take a pause here because it's one of the things I think doesn't get pointed out enough, right? Jesus Christ radically transformed the world in ways that you and I often don't appreciate or even comprehend. And you can go back at the Sermon on the Mount, and it's the most impactful statement ever made in human history is the Sermon on the Mount. It changed the world more than any other thing, or probably all other things combined, ever said by anybody is the Sermon on the Mount. Tremendously transformative to everything. Everything you see, touch, feel, do in life has been influenced by that Sermon on the Mount. And there's a lot of things in there that did this. We won't get into that. But one of the things that Jesus radically transformed was how you think of God. So radically transformed it that practically everybody thinks of God the way Jesus taught them to think. And that is that God is your Father. You realize that is not an Old Testament principle or idea? It only uses Father, speaking of God, like twice. And neither time is it the way you think of it when you say, God is my Father. They meant God is my Father the same way God was the father of the oxen and the trees. He created them. He's the source of it. That's not what Jesus taught. Jesus says, God is your Father. He cares deeply for you, and you have a personal relationship with Him. Tremendously transformative. That's what Peter's talking about here. Peter is speaking, being informed. His position is being informed from that teaching of Jesus that God is our Father. So he says, if ye call on the Father, who without respect of persons judgeth according to every man's work, pass the time of your sojourning here in fear. For as much as ye know that ye were not redeemed with corruptible things, as silver and gold, from your vain conversation received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot, who verily was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you, who by him do believe in God, that raised him up from the dead and gave him glory, that your faith and hope might be in God. Seeing, now I want you to pay attention to this statement he makes, seeing ye have purified your souls in obeying the truth through the Spirit unto unfeigned love of the brethren, see that ye love one another with a pure heart fervently, being born again, not of corruptible seed, but of incorruptible, by the word of God, which liveth and abideth forever. For all flesh is as grass, and all the glory of man is the flower of grass. The grass withereth, and the flower thereof falleth away. But the word of the Lord endureth forever, and this is the word which by the gospel is preached unto you. Wherefore, laying aside all malice, and all guile, and all hypocrisies, and envies, and all evil speakings, as newborn babes, desire the sincere milk of the word, that ye may grow thereby. If so be that ye have tasted that the Lord is gracious. All right. So let's get into this second part that I want to do, and I want you to notice a few things as we look at this. One is, I would like for you this week, and I'm going to give you a little bit of homework, but this week, I want you to take and read this same text again, and I want you to lay it side by side, which you can do real easy nowadays with online software, but you can put this text side by side with John chapter 3, where Jesus first really delves into the idea of a new birth, of being born again. And you can lay this passage side by side with John chapter 3, where Jesus does this, and see just where Peter gets these ideas. It's very important for you to understand that the apostles were not making stuff up. Peter was not this doctrinal genius who came up with this metaphor of a new birth. That is not at all what happened. You looked at this side by side with John chapter 3, and what Peter is teaching in 1 Peter is nothing more than an extrapolation, than a filling out of a teaching that Jesus gave. Jesus taught what the new birth was. Nobody else did. He did. It was prophesied in the Old Testament, and I don't think any of them truly understood what it meant. Deeply understood until Jesus came, because he, talking to the leader of the Jewish sect of the Pharisees, said, "You're a leader of Israel, and you don't understand these things." Nobody understood them until Jesus explained them. Now that Peter understands it, because he's understood it from Jesus himself. So I want you to notice, if you'll do this week and compare those two passages, you'll see that the apostles were highly dependent upon the teachings of Christ. And it isn't just in this one. You can take practically every portion of the New Testament epistles and look at them, and you'll find that they are merely expanding the teaching of Jesus Christ. Now, I say this because it's very important. There are Christians who are much too enamored with the apostles. I think they are tremendous examples of faith. And it is upon the foundation that the apostles laid that we are built as a church. And I don't mean us in this group. I mean the church. This isn't the church, right? We're part of the church, but there's a lot of people all over the world that are part of the church. And we are nowhere near being the exclusive part. I wish we could say we were a drop in that bucket, but we're probably not that much. That's probably being quite optimistic. But yes, the apostles are very important, and and it's critical that we understand what they wrote. But you have to understand that we are not of Paul or of Peter or of James or John. We're of Jesus Christ. Jesus is the author and the finisher of the faith, not Paul. Jesus is the great architect of the church, not Peter. Jesus is. It's very important we understand that. So you can look at that, and you can do it there, and you can do it almost in practically every portion of the epistles, and you'll find the same overlap to some teaching of Christ, where they're expanding it, they are explaining it in more detail, they're applying it perhaps in a way that speaks more to you, because they're dealing with people more like you than Jesus was, perhaps. And so it'll resonate more when Paul talks about it in 1 Corinthians, perhaps, or when Peter talks about it in his second epistle. It'll resonate more. But don't think that means that Paul was somehow pulling something out of his sleeve that nobody had heard of before. They're only teaching what Jesus taught. And Paul says that. He says that if anybody does not assent to the wholesome words of Jesus Christ, he is puffed up and knows nothing. So it's very important we understand that as Christians. All right, so when we look at this thing that Peter's saying, he's talking about this new birth. That's why I wore my born again t-shirt. For those who aren't good with math, didn't know what the formula was. It says born again or born twice, right? He's talking about this new birth. And I want you to think about this question for a second. What is the overall outcome of that new birth? So if you're born again, what's the overall outcome of that? What does that mean in the end? How do we evaluate that we have been reborn? How can we judge that and know if that's true? What's the evidence of that new birth? What's the point of it? Is there a point? I think that there's some of us probably that are more like, in my mindset, whose natural tendency will be to think that the point of the new birth is doctrinal purity. Getting doctrine right. Understanding things properly. Because people like me put a great deal of emphasis on that. That means a lot more to me than probably almost anything else in life, is I want to be right. I don't necessarily care that you know I'm right, although that's not bad. I don't mind that. But that's not really the point. The point is, I don't like to be wrong because being wrong is incredibly inefficient. Right? It's like driving the wrong way. Some people don't mind. I mind. Because then you got to turn around and you got to drive the other way. I remember one time we were on the way to either to Michigan or from Michigan, between Michigan and Texas, and we were driving straight through. So I had driven like, I don't know, 5 or 6 hours. We pulled over, got gas. Terry got in the car, and she drove for like, I don't know, 30 or 40 minutes. I went to sleep. When I woke up, something just didn't seem right. And I'm looking around. I finally realized she got on the freeway going the wrong way. We're headed right back to where we came from. That is inefficiency right there. I heard one time of a evangelist who had preached a revival, I believe, like up in Alaska. And he drove like 10 hours, and it was 2 evangelists, and the other one was in the back of the truck and the camper sleeping. He drove, he pulls into the gas station, fills up the gas, hits the door, they trade places. And the other guy drives 10 hours, pulls in the gas station, and is where they started. They drove 20 hours and got nowhere. That's what it is to be wrong. You should never underestimate the sadness in life if you're wrong. If you're wrong, it is like you are driving through life in the wrong direction. If you want to know what that works out to in doctrine and in practice, you read Ephesians where Paul says, you Gentiles have gone in the wrong direction your whole life. Now you're going to have to come all the way back to zero just to start at zero. It's a bad way to start out. That's why if you're a Christian and you love Jesus Christ and His Word, and you teach your children those values and those truths, they are going to start off in a lot better place than you did if you were a first-generation Christian. You should not lose that ability to do that advantage that you have to give your children a leg up in life. Start off right. What would your life be if you'd been given that advantage? Those of you that are first-generation Christians, if you'd been raised that way, you would have had a tremendous advantage, right? I know some people wish they had these grand testimonies where they could say how they've been saved out of drugs and alcohol and gangs, and you wish you could get up and give that hair-raising testimony where you're more like me, maybe some of you, and you're like, well, I got saved when I was 6 at a Halloween party and a church. So I have a soft spot for Halloween. It's the one holiday I'm like okay with. Right, I go in as a devil, I came out as an angel. Yeah. Alfred says, you didn't get all. And then you're saved at 6, and so what are you going to say? You know, sex, drugs, gangs, and then when I turned 6, I turned my life around and gave it to Christ. You shouldn't ever at all be ashamed that you didn't start off in a hole. You should be very thankful for that. That's a great thing. And yet, is that what the new birth is about? This doctrinal purity, having the right doctrine. We know all the right doctrine. We have all the right ideas. They're all the right answers. I think I do. Because if I didn't, I would change and I would still think I did. Right, Mike? That's right. You're like, well, you don't think you're wrong. Well, of course not. If I thought I was wrong, I'd fix it and still think I was right. Is that what the new birth is about? Is it about holy living? There's another group of Christians. I'm not in that group, but there's a group of Christians that I've met, and I don't mean any official group. I just mean people that I meet that are Christians who aren't so concerned about doctrine, which flummoxes me, but they're very concerned about holiness and right living and integrity and honesty. Is that what the new birth is about? Maybe. How about devout worship? There's those kind of Christians, right? They're about worship. They're just about praising. And every one of these groups, and I'm sure there's a whole lot of other little segmentations we could look at and talk about, they all look at the others a little sideways. The doctrinal ones look over at the worship ones saying, you guys are mindless. And they look at us and say, but you're soulless. Well, that's not what Peter highlights. None of those things. Now, that is not to say that those things aren't important. And like Linda likes to say, we should all seek balance. And like I like to tell her, I am the balance. She loves it when I say that. No, we should seek balance in these things. Yes, doctrine's important. Yes, holiness is important. He says, be ye holy, for I am holy. Yes, worship is important. It's easy to become so academic in our beliefs that we forget to have an amazement of what God does that exceeds any ability we'll ever have to comprehend. All of these things, but none of them are what Peter points out. That's not what he highlights as being the point, the issue of the new birth. So what is the issue of the new birth according to Peter? Well, it's the phrase that I asked you to pay attention to when we were reading. Let's look at it again. It's in verse 22 of chapter 1, Peter 1:22. He says, seeing ye have purified your souls in obeying the truth of the Spirit unto unfeigned love of the brethren. Seeing that you've done that, right? Since you've already done this, he says, now he says, see that ye love one another with a pure heart fervently. This is what the new birth is for, and therefore it is what it ought to produce. You have been born again of the Spirit of God to purify your soul unto unfeigned, unfaked, unhypocritical love of the brethren. See, therefore, pay attention, make sure that you do that. That's what Peter says. Now that makes me feel all icky inside because I don't like that kind of talk. But that's what he says. I want you to consider the apostles as an example of what he's saying here. It's one of the most amazing things to me about the apostles and about what Jesus did in their lives. He didn't go out to the synagogue and find all these deeply religious people who had been steeped in religious thought, religious devout practice. That's not where he went. He pulled out a quote-unquote random set of 11 people from fishing boats and tax booths and shepherds, just pulled out this random cross-section of blue-collar life and put them all together and made them the leaders of the greatest organization or organism, depending on what side of it you're on, right? The world has ever known. The church is not something that God is doing in the middle of doing other things. That's one of my problems with a very popular view of prophecy, is that they put the church kind of in this little valley, this little lull, in which it's like God's like taking a pause from his overarching purpose and he's doing the church. That is so not what the scriptures teach. I'm not a prophecy expert by any stretch of anybody's imagination, but I'll tell you, that's not what it says. It says that the church is all and in all. It is the body of Christ. It is the bride of Christ. It is the pearl that he came to seek. Everything it talks about the church, it is the eternal purpose of God. The entire prophecy of the Old Testament existed to serve the church. We talked about that a few weeks ago. Every prophet, Moses and all the others, existed for your sake as the church. That's why you should not underestimate who you are and what you are, and you need to get your mind right about that. You're not lowly, you're not insignificant, and you're not unimportant. You are, as a member of the church, as a born-again believer in Christ, you are God's eternal purpose. And he chooses these 11 men, randomly it appears, with zero qualifications, zero ability, and he makes them the leader of the church. Now that's interesting, but that's not what's interesting. What's interesting is there's no bloody coup to see who gets to be the leader. There's no pope amongst them. I know the Roman Catholics think that there is, but there is zero evidence in the scriptures of that. There's zero evidence in the scriptures that any one of them said, okay, now I'm the leader, Jesus is gone, and I'm now the leader, and I'm going to tell everyone what to do. Not just for a month. It's easy if you feel all, spiritual. It's easy to be in harmony with each other. But try all of us, just this little group here, living together for about a month. That would be disaster. They lived together. They bunked together. They lived together after Christ left for years. They worked together for years. We find no schisms. The entire time the apostles are alive, there's one church. Not 11 denominations. In fact, they were adamant that that was not the case. Paul says, it is wrong to say, I'm of Paul, I'm of Peter, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Jesus, I'm of all these different things. He says, that's wrong. He says, these people are nobody. I'm nobody. Peter is nobody. The church is everything. Now that's amazing. This was not their natural state. Their natural state was revealed at the Last Supper. When Jesus is there pouring his heart out to them about what is about to happen, how he's about to be tortured and murdered on a cross, and he's trying to give them the last communique of the kingdom, and they're arguing about who has a sword and who doesn't, and they're arguing about who's going to be first and who's going to be second, to the point where Jesus looks at them and says, it's enough. That was their natural state. But that wasn't who they were after. When they had a taste of the power of the resurrection in their lives, like Paul talks about in Ephesians, that incredible, immense, enormous power of God through the resurrection, and it transformed their lives, that was the end of that. Because they had purified their souls unto unfeigned love of the brethren. And that's what they're telling you need to do. Did they care about doctrine? Absolutely. Did they care about holiness and worship? Absolutely. But the new birth had one overarching point, and it still has the same one. To purify our souls unto unfeigned love of the brethren. Now, what does that mean? Well, Peter puts it in a very interesting rhetorical device. He uses a very interesting series of expressions and a metaphor to try to make home the point of what he's talking about. And that is the distinction from being a jaded, cynical, defensive person to being sincere and open and loving. And he uses the metaphor and the contrast between the cynical, jaded, worldly person of the world, with a newborn babe. Jesus used this same contrast when he told us that we should become as little children to enter into the kingdom. To be harmless as doves. You know what's real easy to do as Christians, for you and I to do? Is to think that we need to be more cynical, more suspicious, not to be so gullible and naive. And it's a draw, I believe, especially in our modern world, where we don't believe anything we hear and nothing we see. And we see all the wickedness around us, and it would seem that the proper approach to that, the proper approach to the bad behavior that we experience, to the wickedness that we witness, the proper approach would to become hardened and unbelieving and very wise and very discerning and very skeptical. Peter says, no. That's not the right approach. Peter says, seeing that ye have purified your souls in obeying the truth of the Spirit unto unfeigned love of the brethren, see that ye love one another with a pure heart fervently, being, this is why, because you're born again, of an incorruptible seed, which liveth and abideth forever, right? And then he says in chapter 2, verse 1, wherefore, so this is what you're actually going to do about this. This is the grand goal, he says. Here's the goal. You're gonna love each other with unfeigned love fervently. How are you going to accomplish that? Lay aside all malice and all guile, all hypocrisy, all envy, all evil speaking, and be as newborn babes, desiring the sincere milk of the word. It's about approaching not only the church and brethren, but even the world itself in a way that seems completely counterintuitive. It would seem that he would say, I'm sending you out into wolves, and so you need to be rougher and harder and meaner and smarter and tougher and more vicious so you can survive. But that's not what Christ taught us. He says, I'm going to send you out amongst wolves, and you're going to go out as babes. Now, it seems like that would be just the most foolish approach we could possibly take. I can't imagine any worse advice. And yet that's what Jesus explained, and that's what Paul taught, and that's what Peter taught. We think that our strength and our protection is going to come from within, and that's where we're wrong. We think we need to defend ourselves and fend off everything that's bad around us. Protect ourselves from those that want to hurt us. But that's not what Jesus said. He says somebody comes and they want to take something from you, give it to them. They want to charge you to walk a mile, do it. Your enemy is thirsty, serve him water. Is he hungry? Feed him a meal. Can you think of anything more naive than this? You think, well, I'm going to be taken advantage of. Yeah, that's right. That's what he's saying. He's saying be taken advantage of. Paul says, you have all these arguments in the church and you even have lawsuits going on. Why can't you just be taken advantage of? Why do you think you have to defend yourself? Somebody says something ugly about you, and if you're anything like me, well, you're going to strike back, and you don't ever get even always get ahead. All right, that's my philosophy. It's like, the old Sean Connery line. They bring out a knife, you pull out a gun. That's not what Jesus taught, and that's not what the new birth is about. You were born again so that you could shed that jaded, suspicious, worldly wise shell, and you could become this new creature who sees the whole world in an entirely different light. So when they rage, you're supposed to love. When they insult you, you're supposed to bless them. And that's not euphemistic. Some people think, well, I'm blessing. That's what my grandmother always used to say. I'm going to bless them out. And she didn't mean actually to bless them. She meant other words. He's not being euphemistic. You think, well, man, that is going to make my life very difficult. It seems that way, but it isn't. It isn't. Because that's actually who you are. See, that's what Peter is saying. And this isn't the only thing where he's going to give you a commandment or a task that you're going to find distasteful and difficult. He's going to do more of this in this epistle. And it's all predicated on a simple truth that this is actually who you are. You are not that nasty, cynical person anymore. Because God is not that way. And you're of God. If you've believed in Jesus Christ, you're of God. And you're just pretending to be that way. You're just pretending that you're suspicious and skeptical and worldly wise. You're pretending to be that way. You're not. I'm not here trying to convince you to be a better person. I'm telling you, you already are. You are. You have no choice in the matter. I know you might want to be that nasty person you used to be. It might feel good to some part where you're habituated to like that, but it's not who you are. You're fighting against yourself. Jesus Christ, through his word, has radically transformed the very nature of your existence. You are born again of incorruptible seed. It is your nature to be sincere and open and loving and forgiving and humble. Christians are wasting too much time trying to be what they already are, instead of just understanding, that's who I am. It is my nature to love you. It is my nature to care for you. It is my nature to not defend myself against evil. Now you say, it doesn't feel that way. And that's because you've believed the big lie. And the big lie is, that's not you. And that's what Peter's trying to set straight here. So seeing that you have purified your souls, start living that way. The next time you're approached in a situation where your old self would think, what I need to do is defend myself, I need to set up some walls, I need to put out the porcupine quills, I need to hold everyone off, I need to attack. Remember, that's not who you are. That's not who you are. The next time you think the right answer here is to lash out, just remember, if you're saved, that is not who you are. You're loving and kind and generous. That's who you are. Because that's God's nature in you. You don't have to try to be that. Just like Timothy doesn't have to try to be a Romero. He doesn't wake up in the morning thinking, how am I going to be a Romero today? He just is. You're a child of God. You don't have to try to be. You just are. All right. So next week, we'll look a little bit more further down of some more of the things, the distasteful and uncomfortable things that Peter has to say to us. For now, have a great day, and we'll see you next week. And The Chosen is on tonight, episode 5.